Muy buenas tardes. Les doy la más cordial bienvenida a nombre del Grupo de Estudio de Ética e Inteligencia Artificial y Desafíos Actuales. Les damos la cordial bienvenida a todos los asistentes, personas que son de Chile y también personas externas. Agradecemos a todas las personas que van a llevar a cabo sus exposiciones, también a distintas universidades en general de Latinoamérica. Les comento que vamos a inaugurar en este momento este primer workshop que desarrolla el grupo de estudios y enseguida tendremos la charla magistral de Gouveia, que está programada a las 16:30. Por ende, entre esta inauguración y la charla va a haber un lapso para que también se puedan seguir incorporando todos los invitados y las invitadas que están esperando esa charla magistral. Y posterior a eso, a las 18 horas, comienza la primera mesa de las cuatro mesas que están configuradas para esta ocasión. Bueno, em, este grupo de estudio le da la más cordial bienvenida. Es un grupo de estudio conformado por académicos y académicas de universidades chilenas. Este grupo de estudio ha sido fundado el año 2024 por el doctor Joaquim Giannotti, que está presente, y por quien habla, que en su ocasión fue director de NACSA, el Núcleo de Ciencias Sociales y Artes de la Universidad Mayor de Chile, y que actualmente preside el doctor Joaquim Giannotti. También a partir del año 2025 se han sumado otros académicos eh, de las universidades chilenas, entre los cuales está Camilo Matías de la Universidad de San Sebastián, David Muñoz también, profesor de la Universidad San Sebastián, Alfredo Muñoz de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado y también Alfonso Enríquez de la Universidad de Concepción, Verónica Moreno, también asociada a la Universidad de San Sebastián. Y con este grupo de estudios hemos hecho esta invitación a conformar el primer workshop interuniversitario internacional denominado Problemas Filosóficos en Inteligencia Artificial. Por ende, les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Con enorme alegría y gratitud y sentido de responsabilidad académica, les doy la más cordial bienvenida a este workshop. Y es un verdadero honor encontrarnos hoy en este espacio de reflexión interdisciplinaria, diálogo académico e intercambio internacional, compartiendo con investigadoras e investigadores, docentes, estudiantes, profesionales provenientes de diversas instituciones y países de América Latina y Europa. Quisiera comenzar saludando especialmente a nuestras y nuestros conferencistas, moderadores, ponentes, asistentes que hoy nos acompañan desde Chile, Argentina, Colombia, México, Brasil, España, Alemania y Reino Unido, y otras regiones que hacen posible este encuentro académico. También deseo agradecer profundamente a cada una y a cada uno de ustedes por estar presentes en un tiempo marcado por la velocidad tecnológica, la automatización y la sobrecarga permanente de información. Detenernos a pensar críticamente se ha vuelto un ejercicio profundamente necesario. Y precisamente ese es el espíritu que inspira este workshop. Nos convoca una preocupación compartida, comprender críticamente el impacto que la inteligencia artificial está teniendo sobre nuestras sociedades, nuestras instituciones y nuestra forma de entender el conocimiento, la ética y la experiencia humana. La inteligencia artificial ya no nos pertenece únicamente al ámbito meramente técnico o computacional. Hoy intervienen procesos educativos, sistemas de salud, modelos económicos, plataformas digitales, redes sociales, mecanismos de vigilancia, decisiones jurídicas y múltiples dimensiones de la vida cotidiana. Estamos viviendo un momento histórico en el que las tecnologías inteligentes comienzan a participar activamente en tareas que anteriormente consideramos exclusivamente humanas: interpretar lenguajes, producir textos, generar imágenes, recomendar decisiones, clasificar personas, diagnosticar enfermedades e incluso interactuar emocionalmente con usuarios. Y frente a este escenario, emergen preguntas fundamentales. ¿Qué significa conocer en una época mediada por algoritmos? ¿Qué ocurre con la verdad y la confianza cuando delegamos procesos cognitivos a sistemas automatizados? ¿Puede hablarse de responsabilidad humana en contextos crecientemente automatizados? ¿Cómo evitar nuevas formas de desigualdad, vigilancia o dependencia tecnológica? Estas son preguntas que nos van guiando en el debate sobre la inteligencia artificial y que no pueden reducirse únicamente a cuestiones técnicas. Es también, quizás sobre todo, un problema filosófico, ético, político y humano. Por ello, creemos que resulta indispensable abrir espacios de reflexión interdisciplinarios como este workshop, donde pueden dialogar las humanidades, las ciencias sociales y también las ciencias computacionales. Comprender la inteligencia artificial, por lo tanto, requiere mucho más que desarrollar tecnología. Requiere un proceso de comprensión, también de sus fundamentos epistemológicos, sus implicancias éticas y sus efectos sociales y culturales. Por lo tanto, vivimos en una época fascinante y al mismo tiempo profundamente desafiante. Por un lado, la inteligencia artificial ofrece enormes posibilidades para la medicina, la educación, la investigación científica y múltiples áreas del conocimiento, pero al mismo tiempo también plantea riesgos importantes relacionados con la privacidad, la manipulación informacional, la concentración de poderes tecnológicos, sesgos algorítmicos y deshumanización en ciertos procesos sociales. Por eso necesitamos esa reflexión crítica, seria, rigurosa y responsable, que esté al tanto del estado del arte en cuanto a los problemas filosóficos en estas materias. Necesitamos preguntarnos por ello no solamente qué puede hacer la tecnología, sino también qué debería hacer. Y ahí la filosofía vuelve a ocupar un lugar central. Muchas veces se piensa que la filosofía pertenece únicamente al pasado o a debates abstractos alejados de la realidad. Sin embargo, pocas veces la filosofía ha sido tan necesaria como hoy, porque cuando el mundo cambia aceleradamente, necesitamos herramientas críticas para poder comprender esas mutaciones. Necesitamos un pensamiento ético para pensar responsabilidad y justicia, más allá de los contextos normativos. También necesitamos a la epistemología para reflexionar sobre las bases del conocimiento en la era digital. Necesitamos la ontología y la filosofía de la mente para discutir temas de conciencia, inteligencia y también subjetividad. Y necesitamos pensamiento político y social para analizar cómo estas tecnologías transforman nuestros sistemas distributivos y nuestras sociedades. En este sentido, este workshop busca ser un espacio de encuentro, de reflexión, de interacción y construcción colectiva de un pensamiento algorítmico. A lo largo de estas jornadas tendremos conferencias magistrales, mesas temáticas y también espacios de diálogo académico para abordar estas distintas dimensiones. Y quisiera comentarles brevemente la dinámica de trabajo que tendremos durante estos 3 días. Hoy lunes 25 y mañana martes 26 de mayo, la jornada comenzará con una conferencia magistral, cuya duración será aproximadamente de 40 minutos y cada conferencia magistral estará moderada y guiada por uno de los integrantes del grupo de estudio. Estas conferencias nos permiten introducir en las discusiones fundamentales vinculadas a ética, epistemología, filosofía de la mente e inteligencia artificial desde perspectivas especializadas. Posteriormente, como mencioné hace un rato atrás, habrá un espacio de descanso e ingresaremos a mesas temáticas que están ya plasmadas en el programa, organizadas en torno a distintos ejes de reflexión. Cada ponencia contará con un tiempo aproximado de 15, máximo 20 minutos y será también moderada por uno de los integrantes del grupo de estudio, con el propósito de garantizar una exposición clara, rigurosa y equilibrada entre todas y todos los participantes. Al finalizar cada mesa temática tendremos un espacio aproximadamente de 20 minutos destinado al diálogo para que la concurrencia pueda hacer preguntas o hacer observaciones a los distintos expositores. y se genera así un intercambio público con los asistentes. Quisiera también enfatizar la importancia de esos espacios de conversación que se den al final para que puedan apagar el micrófono mientras las mesas se lleven a cabo en la primera etapa de presentación. Por lo tanto, volviendo al objetivo de nuestro workshop, hay que mencionar que la academia no se construye únicamente mediante exposiciones individuales, también se construye a través de estos intercambios y estos diálogos críticos, la discusión respetuosa y el intercambio de perspectivas. Por ello, les invitamos desde ya a participar activamente, lo pueden hacer también a través del chat. Estaremos con un par de colegas recibiendo sus preguntas y a partir de ello podremos hacer que las mesas lleguen a su desenlace de manera correcta. Uno de los aspectos más valiosos de este workshop es precisamente su carácter interdisciplinar. Ese desafío resulta particularmente también importante a nivel latinoamericano. Muchas veces las discusiones globales sobre inteligencia artificial son producidas desde grandes centros tecnológicos y económicos del norte global. Sin embargo, América Latina también tiene mucho que aportar a estos debates. Tenemos experiencias históricas, sociales, culturales que nos permitan reflexionar críticamente sobre problemas como poder tecnológico, exclusión, perspectivas propias. Por ello, este workshop también busca fortalecer redes académicas, generar reflexiones y poder contribuir a acrecentar el grupo de estudio a un nivel de nexo con otros países. Esperamos que este encuentro permita generar futuras colaboraciones, investigaciones conjuntas, nuevos espacios de diálogo académico. Quiero agradecer nuevamente al grupo de estudios de ética, inteligencia artificial y desafíos actuales, a las instituciones colaboradoras, a nuestras y nuestros moderadores, ponentes y conferencistas, y a todas las personas que hicieron posible esta primera edición. Quisiera finalizar con una breve reflexión. La pregunta más importante respecto de la inteligencia artificial no es simplemente tecnológica, también implica siempre el rol del ser humano. ¿Qué tipo de sociedad queremos construir junto a estas tecnologías? ¿Qué tecnologías orientan la eficiencia y la productividad? ¿O queremos tecnologías compatibles con la dignidad humana, justicia social y responsabilidad ética? Las respuestas a estas preguntas no dependen solamente de programadores o empresas tecnológicas, también dependen de la educación, las ciencias sociales, la reflexión crítica y nuestras filósofas y filósofos. Precisamente por eso estos encuentros son tan relevantes. Entonces sean todas y todos bienvenidos a este workshop interuniversitario. La conferencia magistral será llevada a cabo por el doctor Gouveia. Se llevará a cabo en inglés y comenzará la bienvenida y la moderación de esa mesa nuestro académico y cofundador del grupo de estudio, el doctor Joaquim Giannotti, a quien cedo la palabra si es que desea añadir algún comentario. Sean nuevamente bienvenidos y bienvenidas.
Y muchas gracias, Ever, por la introducción. Muy bienvenidas a todas y todos. Un gusto ver tantas personas que mostraron interés. Hablé con Steven. Steven se unirá a la sesión en 2 minutos. Entiendo, así que podemos empezar a la hora. Y nada, por cualquier duda, pregunta, consulta, puedes escribirnos a Ever o yo, al otro integrante del grupo, si lo vamos apoyando. Así que estoy súper agradecido por ese primer workshop. Ojalá que sea el primero de varios. Y eso, que sea fructífero. Así que soy, soy muy contento de haber leído también muchos resúmenes tan interesantes que abordan temas tan relevantes desde distintas perspectivas. Así que también agradezco por su tiempo para escribir su resumen. Así que yo sugiero que podemos esperar a Steven un par de minutos. Cuando se unan, puedo empezar con la introducción y seguimos con la charla. ¿Qué te parece?
Perfecto, entonces
Perfecto.
tenemos previsto comenzar a las 16:30. Cuando se conecte Steven, Joaquín va a tomar la palabra
Sí,
para presentarlo y por lo tanto dejamos un espacio mientras tanto para que puedan eh, descansar hasta
sí.
esos par de minutos. Gracias.
Mira, justo ahora creo que se unió Steven.
Hola, hola Joaquín, hola Eva.
Hey
Hola,
Hola,
Steven.
Steven,
bien,
how are you?
very good.
Good, good. Well, thank you so much for joining. And just one see, just one thing. So, bueno, so ahora voy, como Ever explicó antes, esta primera charla magistral va a ser en inglés. Así que voy a presentar Steven en inglés, también a moderar la discusión, pero claramente si hay preguntas en español, usted puede escribirla en el chat, podemos traducirla. Claramente esa es un workshop de IA, también esa puede ayudar la herramienta si alguien tiene preguntas. Y, y eso, y Ever, entiendo que vamos a grabar esa sesión.
Sí, todas las sesiones se van a quedar grabadas y
Perfecto.
luego las vamos a subir al canal de YouTube que se ha configurado para este workshop. También después les voy a comentar al final de todo que hay un Instagram y se está publicando en distintas otras partes para que aparezca de manera asincrónica. Y
Ujú.
además, bueno, agradecer a Steven, a ti y Joaquim. Y podemos comenzar siempre las sesiones, van a ser a través de este enlace. La sesión de mañana y la del día miércoles también va a ser a través de este mismo enlace. Si alguien no cuenta con el programa, me puede escribir por interno y se lo puedo enviar en modo de PDF también. Muchas gracias.
Perfecto. Bueno, voy a empezar en inglés entonces. Hey Steven, thank you very much for joining this invitation. It's great to have you again and participate in one of our activities. And so the plan is as follow. I will do a short presentation and then I'll leave the floor to you. And you have like 40, 45 minutes for your talk. And then there's some times for questions. We know that it's late for you, so we are really appreciative of your time. So in case you are very tired, like we can just collect questions and just send them to you and then we can find a way. But if you
Yeah,
want to stay, it would be great. I'm sure there's
yeah,
some
yeah.
people may be interested. So, well, Dr. Stephen Gouveia is a researcher of the Mind, Language, and Action Group of the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Porto. He's also a honorary professor of the Faculty of Medicine of the Universidad Andrés Bello in Chile. And previously, he was a visiting researcher at the Robotics Lab at the University of Palermo and a visiting professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Stephen is a super active researcher and academic, very prolific in the field of neuroscience and philosophy and AI. So I just want to put in the chat Steven's website because there's way so much stuff to cover in a short introduction so that you can see. But I just want to mention a very recent edited volume for Palgrave, the handbook of the ethics of artificial intelligence. And this is a very interesting work because aside from being including a chapter from myself and Ever, this is a very interesting volume in the ethics of AI because it collects many different perspectives from many different disciplines, and it's very comprehensive. I find it very useful. And so this is just like one of the latest edited volumes. I understand, Stephen, that you have many
Yeah.
more incoming. But this is just like to mention that when we think, so as Eber was mentioning at the beginning of the introduction, one of our distinctive features of the way that we think this research group is interdisciplinarity. And so the reason why we wanted to invite Stephen is because due to his trajectory, he's also interested in the AI. We think that sort of kind of embodies the interdisciplinarity, but also the value of doing philosophy. In addition to AI, Stephen also specialized in neurophilosophy, cognitive science. He sort of like investigate the gap between empirical and scientific research and foundational philosophical questions. So he did work in predictive processing, uh, work connected to how brains can anticipate environments, and exploration of how the boundaries between artificial systems and human system. So Stevens, the floor is yours. So I'll give you your 40, 45 minutes, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Joaquin, and thank you, Eva, as well. Let me just try to share my PowerPoint. So I think you should be able to see it now.
Yes, we can see it.
So let me just do I have to do the large screen maybe, right? The full screen or not?
Yes.
Okay, so this should work now.
Perfect.
Okay, so I think I can start. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to keep collaborating with you guys. I'm actually not in Porto now. I'm actually further in Europe. So I'm in Bucharest for a few talks. It means it's 11:30, which is fine because I took some coffee and I have another coffee here. So hopefully I will stay for questions, and people can also make the questions in Spanish because I think I get most of the Spanish at least. So don't worry too much about it. So let's start with the talk. So good afternoon there to most of you. Good night if you are around. Good morning if you are in another part of the world. In this talk, I want to defend a very simple claim, but one with a very significant consequence for the ethics of medical artificial intelligence. In healthcare, prediction is not yet justification. A system may be statistically powerful, technically sophisticated, and impressive under a bunch of benchmark conditions, while still failing to provide what clinical practice actually requires, which is reasons that we can responsibly adopt, that we can question, that we can revise, that we can even audit. So the title AI and Health from Prediction to Justification here means to mark this movement that I want to make. I'm not asking only whether medical AI can predict outcomes or detect risks or improve efficiency, which we know it does this very well, but I'm asking what must happen before such outputs can be treated as reasons for actions in real clinical situations or settings. So that transition is neither automatic nor merely a technical one, right? It is an epistemic one because it concerns what count as evidence and what is warrant or not. It is also normative because medical decisions are usually made under obligations of care, of responsibility, of consent, of accountability, etc. So my central concern will be therefore this space between a model's output and a justified clinical decision. And I will call this a justification gap that arises in medical AI. This gap appears whenever a model performance is treated as if it were already a warrant to act, even though the output has not been situated within any kind of clinical relevance, any kind of institutional adaptation, any kind of patient-centered context. So the talks will follow a specific trajectory. First, I will try to identify two misleading temptations that we have in medical AI. Then I will try to explain why health is actually a particular art case to use in AI. Third, I will define this justification gap, and I will try to provide some illustrations of it through three specific failure modes that I will call it failure modes. And finally, I will argue that even explainability matters only when it becomes a practice of justification rather than just a kind of decorative technical layer that usually people are mentioning or talking about. So the talk here should not be, and this is just a note, I will not talk badly about medical AI. This is not an argument against medical AI. It is actually an argument against a shallow conception of medical governance. The question then it will not be if AI should be used in healthcare, but it will be more under which or what kind of conditions its outputs can enter the space of clinical justification without undermining crucial concepts such as responsibility, trust, or even patient agency. So this will be the main point of my talk. Let me begin with the central argument. Prediction is not justification yet. This may even sound obvious to many of you, but much of the rhetoric around medical AI still moves too quickly from predictive success to clinical legitimacy. So we are told all the time that a system performs very well, that it reaches very high accuracy compared with a human doctor, that it auto-performs many clinicians in many different narrow tasks, or that it can identify patterns that are totally invisible to human experts. So we hear all these statements in many magazines or even like social media posts. Oh, this model performed 99% better than this group of doctors. So this is very common to be heard. But I think the clinical question here is not simply whether the model produces a correct output often enough. I think this is not the right question we need to make. The clinical question we want to make is whether this output can actually be responsibly used as a reason for action in a particular medical context for that patient for a particular time. So this phrase, I think it's very important. In this case, this particular medical case, this particular patient, and in this particular time, because all of these factors are relevant in a real clinical settings. I'm not talking about a fake clinical setting where many of these models are being actually tested. Real medicine is quite different from the kind of experimental simulated environments that these models are being performed. So I think evidence becomes clinically meaningful only when it is integrated in a concrete decision-making situation with a particular history, with a particular risk, particular alternatives that could be made. And I think a benchmark can tell us something about the model performance under a specific evaluation frame, which is always biased, so in some sense. But I don't think it cannot say, just by itself, whether a given output is legitimate at the bedside. This is why I want to distinguish between bench performance and what I called a bedside warrant. Bench performance concerns discrimination, calibration, error rates, net benefit, other technical measurements or metrics that we do in traditional benchmarking. Bedside warrant concerns whether the output can actually be adopted within a chain of reasons. Reasons that clinicians can defend, that the patient can understand, or can context even, which happens in traditional medicine. And that also that institutions can actually audit, right? Like this is an important aspect of responsible medicine. A model may be quite impressive in the first dimension and still be very weak in the second dimension I just mentioned. And I think the justification gap names precisely this distance between the two. It is this gap between a validated model performance and the right to treat the model's output as a clinical reason. The gap matters here because clinical practice is not merely about producing actions. It's about producing actions that can be answerable by someone, by a doctor or by an institution, and that can be understood for a patient or for I don't know, a representative of the patient, etc. So when a clinician recommends a specific iteration, when he modifies the treatments, when he orders a specific antibiotic, when he prioritizes a patient over another, when he withholds a procedure that was in place, all these actions, they must be justifiable, even if given by a model's output. It must be possible to ask why this action rather than another, why now and not later or not before. What alternatives were considered in this specific case? What uncertainty remains? Who is responsible if the recommendation proves some kind of harm? This is why I think explanations in the weak technical sense is not enough. A feature attribution map, a salience image, a natural language rationale, they may appear to explain the output, but it may not supply a warrant clinical action that doctors can use in a legitimate way. So I think the real problem here is not merely the absence of explanation, which it's quite common for people to claim, right? Because these models usually they are black boxes and therefore we don't have an explanation. My point is that even when we have an explanation in the sense that we have an output that is clearly given, I think the problem here is that we have a lack of justification for this specific explanation. And why? Because justification is not an individual feature, but it's a social, it's an institutional, it's a normative practice, and not merely a property of a kind of a computational system of some kind. So I think the first conceptual shift is this. Medical AI ethics should not ask only whether the model predicts or whether the model can be explained. It must also ask whether the output can be owned, can be contexted, can be reviewed, and can be integrated into the clinical care without generating preventable harm. And I think this is the kind of governing question that I want to focus on during the rest of the talk. Before going to the details, I want to talk about two temptations. The first one is this idea that accuracy is enough. If a model is very accurate, therefore nothing more is needed from a normative point of view. I think this is a very naive view. If the model is accurate, then ethics becomes completely secondary and perhaps it's even optional in many cases. On this view, the ethical task is mainly to avoid obvious abuses, while the real work is to maximize performance. The better the model, the less ethical anxiety we need to have. But healthcare, I think, is precisely the wrong domain for this kind of inference. Accuracy cannot be authorized without a context, without accountability, and without clinical relevance. A prediction may be statistically reliable and still fail as a reason for action. To use a formal distinction, let P mean that the system is accurate and on a benchmark relevant to a task, and let W mean that the output is warranted as an actionable clinical reason in a concrete case. The temptation here is to assume P implies W in every case. But clinical practice shows that this inference is defeasible. P does not automatically produce W, contrary to what many people think in this research field. There are many ways in which this can actually happen. The model may have been validated on a population that does not sufficiently resemble to the deployment population. The outcome may be defined through a proxy that does not capture any clinical value we care about. The model may function adequately in isolation, but it may create harmful workload effects when inserted in a real hospital system. Or even its input data may reflect biased measurement of practices. In all of these cases, this system can be accurate in a very limited sense while still lacking warrant as a clinical reason. The point here is not to claim, of course, that accuracy is not relevant at all. So I'm not saying that accuracy is totally irrelevant. Of course, it matters, and of course, we want models that can be accurate. A systematically inaccurate system cannot be ethically reliable, of course. But accuracy is not sufficient, and this is my point, is not a sufficient condition because medical reasoning is not exhausted by statistical performance. Medical reasoning involves more than that. It involves judgment under uncertainty. It requires interpretation, responsibility, intercommunication, responsiveness to the patient situation. And if the model cannot be situated in this within this justificatory chain, then its accuracy remains ethically incomplete. So the core distinction is between prediction and warrant. Prediction concerns what the model outputs. Warrant concerns whether that output can legitimately guide action. The ethical danger appears when the first is mistaken for the second. In medicine, to act on a prediction is to transform a statistical object into a clinical reason. That transformation must itself be justified ethically. The second temptation is closely related to the first one, but still different. It's this idea that ethics comes after. So we build the system first, we optimize performance, we deploy it, and only then we add governance layer, we add consent forms, transparency statements, compliance documentation, etc. We can summarize this temptation as optimizing first, govern later. And I think this is completely wrong. The reason this is wrong is that healthcare is already a reason-given practice. Ethics is not an external layer that you can add to the clinical care after the technical work is completed. Clinical practice is structured by both epistemic and normative standards from the beginning. Clinicians do not merely act in a random way. They must be able to justify what they do to patients, what they do to other colleagues, the kind of conversations and reasons they exchange with each other, their position inside an institution, and even sometimes in courts, right? Whenever there is a juridical problem, so they must be justified under very specific epistemic standards, such as what count as evidence or a reasonable clinical inference, and which and also under specific normative standards, such as what is an acceptable risk in a specific situation, what is an acceptable harm, what is consent, what is fairness, what is a responsible option in a specific case. When an AI system enters this practice, it does not enter a neutral space. It enters a space already organized by obligations of justification. And this means that the relevant design question is not only whether the model performs well, but whether it supports the justificatory work that medicine requires. Can the clinician explain why reliance on the system was reasonable? Can the patient meaningfully question or refuse a decision made by an AI? Can the institution reconstruct how the decision was made and who was responsible for it? If there is no clear path from output to justification, then each of these actors are placed in a compromised position from an ethical point of view. Clinicians cannot rely responsibility because they may be asked to act on outputs they cannot defend from an epistemic point of view. Patients cannot context meaningfully because the basis of the decision remains completely obscure. And institutions cannot assign responsibility because accountability is very diffuse between different developers, vendors, procurement decisions, interfaces, clinical users, etc. So therefore, justification must be built into the system from the start. This means designing not only for predictive performance or predictive success, but for contestability, for auditability, for role-sensitive explanation, uncertainty, for communication, for documentation and review. So I think my point is that ethics is not a late-stage decoration, but should actually be implemented from the beginning. Why is health an hard case for AI ethics? I think the answer is that healthcare binds epistemic dependence and normative vulnerability together. So patients, they depend on professionals for interpretation, for options, for action, and in many cases they cannot independently, and this is important, they cannot independently verify the medical significance of their symptoms, their test results, or the treatment options. And this asymmetry is not an accident, right? This is part of the clinical care. And I think AI can intensify this asymmetry even more. A machine learning system, for example, may shift epistemic authority away from a clinician, which is a human that can justify his actions and his options to the patient, towards a purely computational output, while failing to completely provide any transparent or contextual grounding for that authority. The patient may be told that the system recommends a certain intervention or identifies a certain risk or that he deprioritized a certain pathway. But if neither the patient nor the clinician can reconstruct why that output deserves reliance, then authority has moved away without any justification. And this is why the patient must not be treated merely as a data subject. The patient is a moral subject before that. A patient agency is exercised through consent, to refusal, to deliberation, and many times to self-understanding of the medical narrative that is being provided. A treatment plan is not simply an optimized output. It is a practical commitment made under specific conditions of vulnerability. It concerns the patient's body, the patient's expectations about the future, about the risks that he can have, about certain values that he may have, and maybe sometimes about irreversible harms that can be made. And this is why I think healthcare cannot be reduced to a mere engineering optimization. The key concept here is an ecology of justification. Explainability must operate inside this ecology of clinical reasoning. It must support autonomy, shared decision-making, case-sensitive reasoning, and institutional responsibility. It is not enough for the system to generate a plausible explanation after the fact. The explanation must help to the relevant actors to understand what is being claimed, why it matters, what alternatives exist, and how responsibility will be distributed in that case. This also clarifies why health is not just another high-stakes domain. In some domains, aggregate improvement may be the dominant metric, but medicine includes specific case-sensitive and person-sensitive obligations. Clinicians, they own patients' reasons that can be understood, that can be challenged, or that can be integrated into the patient's life. So medical AI, therefore, uh, must be evaluated not only by whether it improves the outcomes in the aggregate, but by whether it preserves the justificatory structure of care, which I don't think it does it right now. Most contemporary AI ethics frameworks, they appeal to general principles such as transparency, accountability, fairness, privacy, safety, human oversight. And I'm not trying to say that principles are not relevant again. I think they are necessary. They provide important normative orientations at least. But I think specifically in healthcare, they are not sufficient at all because principles, they determine implementation in this specific case. The problem here is not that the principles are false and we need other general principles. The problem is that they are often too abstract to determine what must happen in a very specific, concrete clinical workflow. So saying that a system must be transparent does not yet tell us what kind of explanation is needed, for whom, at what point in the care pathway, and for which decision. Saying that a system must be accountable does not yet tell us who is answerable when an harm occurs: the clinician, the hospital, the vendor, the developer, the procurement committee, or some kind of combination between them. This is why I treat trust not as a psychological variable to be maximized, but as a relation that must be warranted. Calls to increase trust can be dangerous even if they aim merely to make users more comfortable with opaque system. In medicine, the goal should not be more trust as such. The goal should be justified trust, reliance grounded in reasons, in procedures, and in accountability structures. The same applies to explanations. So explanations, they only matter when they support questioning and revision. A polished explanation cannot be challenged. Like a very good explanation that cannot be challenged is not a clinical justification at all for any kind of medical decision. A transparency artifact that cannot support decision review is not enough, in my view. What matters is whether the system enables a communicable and contextual justificatory exchange among the clinicians, the patients, and institutions. So the phrase that I have in the slide is basically central. Public certification, not declarative transparency. Medical AI governance should be judged by whether it creates conditions in which reasons can be offered, examined, revised, and when necessary, rejected, which is something that we already know. It's very hard to do. Many doctors, real life doctors, they feel many problems, epistemic and normative maybe, to reject a model's output that goes against their own medical decision, for example. And many of the times they basically fall into this artificial bias. I don't know, there's another name for it, but basically it's when like because you have doubts about your own decision, you opt for the decision that the AI is making because you believe that the AI is better prepared to deal with all the relevant epistemic points that are needed for that specific scenario. So this is something that we actually know it's already happening, and I think it should be avoided. And it happens exactly because we do these two mistakes that I was trying to point about. So I think we can now define the central concept that I'm trying to talk about. So this justification gap is then the gap between a validated model performance and the right to treat model outputs as clinical reasons in care. It remains even when a model scores very well on discrimination, on calibration, or in net benefits, for example. The point here is not that performance metrics are useless. The point is that they are narrower than a clinical deployment. Evaluation, they fix many things that deployment does not fix at all. It fixes outcomes, labels, population, temporal windows, assumptions about how the model will be used. Deployments, they usually reopen all these assumptions, right? So a model is inserted in a real life situation, in a real hospital, for example, with a specific staffing levels, alert systems, documentation practice, resource constraints, patients population, institutional incentives of different kinds. And then the model outputs will interact with human attention, with uncertainty, with liability, with different care pathways that are always different from even the same hospitals in the same city. The different hospitals in the same city, they can have all these protocols different from each other. So once these outputs, they become reasons, errors are no longer merely statistical, right? They shape triage decisions. They help us to think about admission timing, antibiotic administration, follow-up priorities, patient trajectories. Of course, a false positive is not just a point in a confusion matrix. It may generate anxiety, it may generate over-treatment or under-treatment, unnecessary interventions of many kinds. It can provoke more fatigue that it's needed, and we already know that medical staff and healthcare staff in general are overworked. So fatigue is a big problem for healthcare in general. So I think the justification gap here has three important features that we need to consider. First, it can persist even when the model is conventionally accurate, so it is not reducible to bad performance. Second, it is morally relevant because it redistributes risk across patients, across clinicians, and across institutions. And third, it is not solved simply by offering an explanation. An explained output must still be unwarranted if the target measurement or deployment context is completely misaligned with care. So I try to express this in a more formal way. The justification gap appears when a model has good validated performance but lacks warrant to be treated as a clinical reason. When evaluation deployment mismatch defeats warrant, when the existence of an explanation does not guarantee warrant, and when a validated but unwarranted output are treated as reasons in practice, thereby becoming morally salient. So the real question then is not only whether we can explain the model, the real question is whether the output can be owned, context reviewed, and integrated without preventable harm that we can clearly identify. And if the answer is no, then this model may be useful just as a statistical instrument, but it has not yet become a justified participant in clinical reasoning, in clinical settings, at least not in real life situations. I don't mind using these models to, I don't know, to play in simulated laboratories of healthcare. This can provide interesting protocols or even different medical um, I don't know, politics of some kind, but you should not use this in real life settings. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. Why? Because there are three kinds of failure modes, which I call them, that can happen when you don't take this seriously. So the first failure mode is actually predicting the wrong thing. And this is very famous by the Obermeyer case, which probably you know about. The algorithm was used to identify patients who would benefit from extra care management, but it predicted healthcare costs rather than illness or need. Why? Because it's easier, it's very hard to look for the data about illness or need, which are sometimes taken as very subjective. But the point was, let's use the money that these people spent in healthcare, because this is a more objective measurement. And if they spend a lot of money, it means they need more healthcare in general, because they are more sick. So, but of course, because Black patients, due to unequal access and structural disparities, they generated lower healthcare spending than white patients with comparable illness, and basically the algorithm treated them as less in need. So this is a clear racist biases, right? That actually does not solve a problem, it even deepen a problem that already exists, even though it's performing very well, right? From the data that was used, the performance, the prediction is amazing, but it's predicting the wrong thing that we want. So the model learned a real statistical pattern, the money spent, but the pattern encoded a completely injustice. So I think the key point is that the target here was technically useful but ethically distorted. So healthcare costs appear to be a plausible proxy for health, but it was not neutral. It is important. It is an imported unequal access to care into the model's grounded truth. If a population receives less care because of structural injustice, then cost is not a clean measurement of need. It is a partially a record of prior deprivation, even. So the justification gap appears here in a very clear form. We have a high-performing predictor of costs, but not a warrant tool for distributing clinical attention. The output may be statistically accurate with respect to the target, yet the target is completely misaligned with the ethical purposes of the intervention. In such cases, performance preserves and scales the distortion rather than correcting what needs to be corrected. And this is a broader problem in medical AI in general. What is often very easy to measure is often not what really matters clinically or even ethically. Billing codes, utilization patterns, lengths of stay, cost curves, and administrative labels. These are all data that is available and that many of these companies who develop these models use for feeding the model, and they are quite convenient, right? But what is really needed, the suffering, the preventable deterioration, dignity, fair access are all harder to measure in an objective way. When proxy targets become the objective function, the model can improve a technically coherent task while undermining a clinical point of the task. So the lesson here is not merely that algorithms can be biased. The deeper lesson is that a model success depends on how success itself is defined in the first place. If the target encodes injustice, then model performance is not a solution. It is a mechanism for institutionalizing the wrong norm. A risk score built on a distorted target score is an error. It turns historical inequality in prospective allocation. And this failure mode shows why justification must include target scrutiny. Before asking whether the model predicts well, we must ask what exactly is it predicting? Is that the target clinically meaningful that we want to address? Does it reflect need or merely access? Does it preserve a structural inequality or does it fight this inequality? Without all this prior justificatory work, which is an ethical one by design, accuracy can completely become ethically misleading. Another kind of error that can happen is concerned with workflow and ecological context. A model is not an oracle standing outside the practice. It is an intervention inside a workflow. Once deployed, it affects the intention, the timing, the documentation, the responsibility, and the distribution of the burdens across clinical terms. The EPIC sepsis model here is another useful case to illustrate this kind of mistake. External validation showed substantially weaker performance than developer-reported performance. But the deeper point is not simply that a model underperformed in this specific EPIC species model. The deeper point is how this underperformance matter once embedded in a clinical workflow. Clinicians do not experience model performance as rock curves. They experience it as interruption, as false alarms, as missed cases, as institutional pressure to respond. In the sepsis care, timing is morally loaded, right? So delays, they can actually be dangerous, they can kill a patient, but unnecessary treatment can also cause harm. Poor calibration and excessive alerts can produce overtreatments, antibiotic overuse, alert fatigue, or misdeterioration. And the output here is not merely information. It changes what clinicians notice, how they allocate their cognitive attention, how they understand their responsibility in a specific real situation. The ecology point here is that the same model can have a different ethical meaning in different real life settings. So different hospitals will have different performances of the same model because clinical reasoning is an ecological dynamic, it's not an individual kind of work. A system that appears acceptable under one institutional arrangement may lack warrant under another. So deployment here is not simply the transport of a model from a lab to a clinic. It is actually a reconfiguration of the clinical practice in that specific hospital or clinic. The model's output has to be interpreted, prioritized, act upon, ignored, escalated, depending of the clinician's experiences, the clinician's flow of work, if they are already operating under time pressure, for example, if the interface produces high frequency alerts, the alleged explanation may become completely practically unstable for the workflow. So even a technically explainable system can fail if its explanation arrives in a form that it disrupts rather than supports responsible clinical reasoning. So I think the ethical lesson here is that validation must also be ecological. We must evaluate not only the model, but how the human AI team work. The model, the interface, the clinicians, the workflow, the institution, the patient's pathway. Without this, what we can call without this ecological calibration, performance metrics under describe what matters. They tell us how the model behaves in abstraction, but not whether reliance is warranted in a specific care. And this, so even if we can create a perfect model for a specific context where this model is totally warranted from the start to finish, you cannot take the same model and apply it in another country or even in another city, expecting that is warranted in the same way. So warrant is a property that is ecologically instantiated and not instantiated just by the model itself. And finally, a third kind of failure mode can happen when you don't take the justification gap seriously. So this is the maybe more famous, the bias in the infrastructure. Here, the problem is not located in the model itself. It is located in the measurement world that produces the inputs and labels on which the algorithm will depend on. Medical AI does not learn from reality directly. It learns from a measured reality, and measurement practices can themselves be biased, and they are actually many times, if not always, quite biased. The pulse oximetry provides a stark example of this. Studies have shown that the pulse oximetry can overestimate oxygen saturation in Black patients, producing higher rates of acute hypoxemia. This means that a patient may appear adequately oxygenated according to the device, while actually having dangerously low arterial oxygen levels. If an AI system uses this measurement, the distortion enters the pipeline before the model is even being trained. This is why I say that the pipeline itself is a bias before the model is trained. The algorithm may be fair with respect to the measured data and still unfair in practice because the measurement process does not function equally across different patients groups. Training fixes and post-processing interventions are inadequate if sensor ecology remains untouched. The deeper problem here is clearly justificatory. Clinicians, they justify actions on the basis of numbers that do not function equally across patients. Oxygen saturation appears as an objective fact, again, but if the measurement behaves differently across bodies, then the clinical reason given process is completely corrupted from an ethical point of view. The clinicians may even believe they are acting on a neutral evidence while actually relying on an unequal measurement infrastructure. And this case also shows why fairness cannot be reduced to just model-level statistical parity. Health equity requires attention to the entire socio-technical chain: devices, datasets, labels, clinical assumptions, deployment settings, and institutional responses. A model can justify a narrow fairness metric while still reproducing harm through these biased inputs. The justification gap in this infrastructural form appears when performance is claimed without examining whether the evidential base is ethically reliable. If the numbers are distorted, then the reasons built on those numbers are compromised by consequences. Performance without warrant can deepen unjustly precisely because it gives us biased infrastructure that has this appearance of objective authority, which are not objective at all. So I think I want to turn now about the nature of explanation, and I think a common move in contemporary, at least explainable AI, is to treat this explanation separate from the output. So, for example, this kind of salience map where you see different colors for how the different outputs were used for a specific output. Um, they are all produced after the prediction. And in healthcare, this is quite attractive because it promises a kind of modular solution. You build the predictive system, you attach an explanatory inference or interface, and you declare the model transparent enough. But this view, I think, is too weak, especially for healthcare. Explanation as outputs may produce coherence without accountability. It might tell us which features were influenced for the model or which region of an image was salient, but it may not answer the clinical why question. why should this output be relied upon here for this patient under these risks rather than an alternative course of action. So I therefore try to distinguish here explanation as output from explanation as a process. Explanation as process treats explanation as part of the justificatory practice. Reason must be answerable to patients, to clinicians, to institutions, and the clinical encounter is not a passive consumption of computational outputs. It is a space in which reasons are offered, context, and owned by a specific actor. This matters because the doctor is not merely a user of the model, the doctor remains an accountable agent, or at least he should remain one. They must be able to explain why a particular intervention was chosen, why alternatives were rejected, and why reliance on the system was reasonable in a specific case. If the clinician can only say, I did this because the system told me to do so, then explanation has completely failed as a justification. The same is true for patients. Patients, they do not need only a simplified summary of their medical situation. They actually need an explanation that is adequate to their role as a moral subject. An explanation that supports their consent, their refusal, their meaningful participation in this clinical setting, which are decisions that will affect their own body and their future, their immediate future and their long-term future. Institutions, in turn, they also need explanations that can be adequately audited, that can provide incident review, that can provide procurement oversight, kind of protocol liabilities of all kind. This is, I think, the relevant question then is not whether a model has an explanation attached to it. The question is whether this explanatory practice supports the responsibility that should be distributed over the different clinical ecology that I just mentioned. Explanation must help clinicians rely responsible. They must help patients to context meaningfully and institutions to govern in an effective but also ethical manner. Otherwise, the explanations in this turn, they only remain a polished surface of a very deep, unsolved justification gap. I'm not sure how I'm doing with my time.
There are still 15 minutes for, well, 17
Okay.
minutes for the session.
For the
So if you
entire
can-
session.
For the entire session, yeah. So if you want to
okay.
close like in 10
So
minutes
maybe
or so.
Yeah, I will. No, I want to close early, so maybe. So yeah, I will finish this and then I skip the conclusion maybe. So this brings us to the specific distinction that I usually make in my papers between easy and hard intelligibility. So easy intelligibility is specified when an explanation sounds coherent, familiarly, and narratively plausible. It is the level at which a user can repeat the explanation and feel that it makes sense to himself. Many post-hoc explanations, especially in natural language rationales, can perform quite well in this level. But easy intelligibility is actually ethically cheap. It can be achieved through plausibility engineering. A story can fit our expectation without even tracking the real warrant for reliance. A heat map can actually look quite persuasive while failing to show what clinically relevant features actually matters. A fluent explanation in natural language can create confidence without even preserving uncertainty, which is certainly an important aspect in real medicine. And of course, again, in medicine, this is quite dangerous because it confronts, because confront can actually be mistaken for justification. So are the intelligibility something harder to achieve? And it's something more demanding from an epistemic point of view. It asks whether the explanation has justificatory tractation within the institutional space of clinical reasons. Does it really help the clinicians to be responsible for a specific case? Does it allow to have medical disagreement, which is most of the cases, you should think that, of course, like a simple flu is not hard to solve from a medical point of view, right? So you don't need to provide too many reasons, but you don't need to use a AI model for that, right? You have clear symptoms over time. So of course, some flus are hard to identify. Think about the COVID pandemic, right? It's like before we knew that there was a COVID virus, like we thought it was just a normal flu and we made bad decisions based on this assumption. But think that AI models, they are being used in cases that are quite difficult to be solved from a medical point of view. So in these cases, you actually need confront. You need to think alternatives. You need to have disagreements between different experts in order to achieve the right kind of treatment or prognostic, etc. So I think hard intelligibility is not a single property of the model. It is a set of conditions that make explanation usable within healthcare. And here I provide 5 criteria for what I call a justifiable explanation. First, an explanation must be provided. So this sounds quite basic, but it is actually the entry condition. If nothing is offered, there is no object that can do the justificatory work. So one of the conditions is actually models, they need to provide some kind of explanation, which many, they do not actually. At least currently, many medical AI models, they don't provide any explanation. Second, it must be honest about uncertainty. So it must not convert a probabilistic inference into a false clinical confidence. In medical machine learning, the ability to say, this is my output, but this output is only an inference, it's only a probabilistic calculation. I think this message can be ethically central. Third, the explanation must be stable. If clinically irrelevant noise or pre-processing changes radically alter the explanation, then the explanation cannot support a warranted reliance. Fourth, it must be aligned with clinically meaningful concepts. It should track signs, symptoms, mechanisms, risks, and categories that structure clinical reasoning, not merely engineering-friendly correlations. And fifth, the explanation must be contextual. It must support a fair review. A justifiable explanation should allow affected parties to ask what counts as a defeater, who reviews this output, by what standards, what can be changed, what procedures exist if the output is harmful or disrupted. Without contextability, explanations, they become one-way persuasion rather than public justification, which I think the explanation should achieve to. These 5 criteria, they do not eliminate, of course, all medical uncertainty that we'll always have in medicine. Medicine will always involve some kind of uncertainty, but I think they help us to distinguish explanations that are merely loose, that merely looks intelligible, from explanation that can actually function as a warrants and that can provide reasons. All of this argument is not to maximize explainability. This is not my goal. What I'm trying to do here is what is the right kind of intelligibility for the relevant role of explanations in healthcare context. And this will be my main message here. So yeah, so I will skip the conclusion, but maybe I think I was clear that prediction does not guarantee justification a priori, and this needs to actually be demonstrated, needs to be clearly created, and not just by the output, but for this ecology of actors that are in contact with this output. So here are just some of the references. And yes, that's it.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Steven. Don't worry, it's perfect. We have some times for questions. So now tenemos espacio para preguntas. Puede escribir en el chat, puede levantar su mano también. Nosotros vamos a moderar. So Steven, thank you very much. So while we are waiting for some questions, I would like to ask you to start the discussion. I would like to ask you, what do you think the implication of this sort of proposal are with respect to cooperation between different clinical and scientific institutions at the global level? Because some of the examples that you show really highlighted how, I mean, there should be also willingness for different clinical institutions to collaborate and to share data,
Yeah.
for example, to train the model together collaboratively. So I just wanted to ask you whether you have some views on that. And then we have a question from Johan.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, which takes, I think, the political level of my argument, right? So I think, for example, regarding, but this is quite problematic, I think. But I think healthcare data should actually be a public, it should be in public domains of governments. But this is quite dangerous as well. So we need to think exactly how we want to make this work, right? But it's not so different as like we know like the governments have all our economical data, for example, right? And of course, this sometimes it can be hacked by private people, and they can use this in a bad way. But at least we have some kind of security measurements that can help us to guarantee that the money I have in my bank, is still there tomorrow, etc. So we have safety mechanisms. So I think we can use this kind of safety mechanisms and apply them for our healthcare data in general as well. But I think a more like worldwide perspective will be very interesting and will be actually more fair. But we have another problem, which is it seems to be irrelevant, but it's actually fundamental, which is who are these companies producing these models? They are not usually, of course, we see some universities developing these models, but those who are really interested in these models, they are actually private companies, right? They are technological companies even. They are not medical companies. And they even sometimes they hire the best minds of academia, right? This is even happening in philosophy. So these companies, they are hiring very good philosophers to work on their and the first thing they have to do is actually to sign these non-disclosure agreements, which is a weird thing for a philosopher, because if your point is to actually talk about the ethical, work of your company, and then you cannot even provide details of what they are doing, it's a weird contract. So I think my point will be, it will be very interesting to have a kind of global cooperation for healthcare data specifically. But I think this will be very hard to be achieved for different political reasons. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about Anthropic and the philosopher of Anthropic. We have a question from Johan.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I guess I had a small issue trying to follow the implications of your approach. So the way I understand what you propose is that, again, well, predictive power and reliability is not enough. We need, let's say, a more normative, let's say, ground for deploying these models in medical AI, or these AI systems in medical AI. But then what's the recommendation, I guess, right? So should we stop deploying these models until we solve, I don't know, the black box problem or something like that? Or is okay to deploy them? But yeah, I guess doctors have to own the prediction somehow and come up with a particular explanation. Or yeah, I guess, and that's something that probably, I don't know if it counts as an objection, but I guess something I was thinking while I was listening to you, and is that what if we give patients the option of choosing, I guess. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but if you ask me, for instance, if I prefer a super reliable AI compared to a doctor that maybe is not as reliable but potentially can provide an explanation, I guess I would prefer personally a super reliable AI. It's also like that it's a too crazy approach. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, so there are interesting questions, right? So regarding the first question, I would say the following. I think we like medical AI tools. Sometimes they're so this is complex because different regions of the world they will have different jurisdiction for these tools, right? So some countries they actually think medical tools are just technological tools, and because of that, they don't need to go through all the safety, and regulations of medical tools. They can only be used as a technological tool, and that's it. And I think this is quite dangerous. So I think first of all, we need to regulate these tools uh, about their nature, right? Like, and they are medical devices, really. So, but of course, this will be very different from different law backgrounds. So, like I don't know, in Europe we are trying to regulate more. In America, this is less regulation, more development. So let's not constrain the development. Let's provide all the tools for the markets to develop how they want it. But I think my main point is what we actually need to do is we need to do better medical AI. So we need to think a better AI in general, but also a better medical AI in general. And this means that maybe we should stop for a bit of time, we should stop producing all these crazy models, and we should rethink, we should do this process of re-engineering the ethical demanding that I'm trying to make here, which are also epistemic in some sense. So we need to redesign all these models to have all the points I was trying to make from the beginning until the end. Because now the usual approach is what I told you about. It's the ethics comes after. So let's do the model first. Let's test the model, and then we can correct it here and there, but only in a later stage when actually it's quite difficult to actually correct the model by nature. So my point is we need to higher up the demanding, the ethical demands of this production in specific. And this may require to stop developing models in a short time. It may require to actually invest more money in this field. And this is a separate argument that I have. So I do think that, for example, I have this prioritization argument in favor of medical AI. So we are spending a lot of money and resources in developing AI in general, for example, for automated cars, for e-commerce and e-banking. This is the two fields where we spend more money. And medical AI is actually, we only spend 4% of the total budget of AI funding on medical AI. And my argument is that medical AI can solve a lot of the problems we actually have in the world. Like half of the population doesn't have access to primary healthcare, for example. And medical AI can be a very important tool, but it needs to be a tool that is well developed from the beginning until the end. And this is not something that I'm seeing right now. But I'm not seeing it because, first of all, there is not so much regulation or care, and then there is not a lot of resources as well. I think we have good reasons to believe that autonomous cars are not so important than medical AI per se. Like when you see the pros and cons of developing these two technologies, you will see that at least from a human perspective, medical AI solves a lot of the problems we have, and autonomous cars they solve just a few problems, right? They will solve the traffic problem that's only not even half of the world have. And is traffic very important, or is human lives more important than traffic? Like but this is a different argument, I think. But so I see we have reasons to stop and then to develop better medical AI that we are doing now. And this implies to have all these ethical points that I'm trying to make. This maybe implies hiring ethicists for this developing teams as well, but not in a ethical washing way, which is what's happening now. So, well, the idea is like let's hire this great philosopher because this will show society that we care about ethics, even if in practice you really don't care about ethics. So we need, and this can be actually transparently shown. Like you can literally ask a company, show me your ethical, documentation. What are you are doing for testing the ethical implications of your model, etc. So I don't know if I'm answering any of your questions, but let me see. The second question was about what? Oh yeah, about choosing. Yeah, again, but there the patient is not taking a medical decision. It's only taking a optimization decision, an engineering decision, I would call it. And he should be aware of that. So because it's not even the right output will not save his condition. Like an output is only part of a very complex and long chain of medical decisions that need to be made. Like a common person, even if the output says something that is true, he can he cannot survive to, I don't know, to a specific medical condition. Like medicine is more than just optimized decisions, right? It's more than that. It's not just that, at least.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, John, for the question. I think there's time for one last question by Roberto Berrios. Stephen, I don't know if you can read the chat.
Yeah, so let me revert this question. So what is your opinion on the future state of artificial superintelligence, which would have human-like cognitive capabilities such as creativity, logic, reasoning, and others? Yeah, but I think superintelligence is not human-like. It's even further than that, right? Like it's an hyper-human-like capabilities. Yeah, so I don't believe in superintelligence in the sense that I don't even believe in intelligence in the sense that intelligence is not only it's not a one concept that we can clearly recreate in an artificial setting. Intelligence is a multi-complex concept. It basically under its concept there are many mini concepts, sub-concepts that are presented there, and I don't believe that no human like not no human but no animals can be intelligent. I think intelligence is biologically based. uh, of course we are all very impressed by what ChatGPT does, what by I don't know, like I was very impressed with in 98, even though I was only 6 years old, but I saw the match with the Kasparov and Deep Blue, and Deep Blue finally won the second match. The first match was 1 year before, and actually Kasparov won that match. But the year after, Kasparov was defeated by this artificial chess model. And we can ask, was Deep model intelligent? I don't think he was intelligent. He was not even a good chess player, because to be a player, you need to be a human. He was only a model that was processing data from millions of games before, and he was just trying to predict the best model, the best choice there. But I don't think we can say it was intelligent. We can do a narrow statement, which was maybe it was chess intelligent, which something that I can accept, but it was not intelligent in the sense that human beings are intelligent, that human beings can transfer knowledge from one setting to another completely different setting. This is something that AI doesn't do. You can put the Deep Blue model solving another game, it will perform awfully. And this is one of the problems we have with AI development right now. Like models are only being developed for a specific, very narrow task, and its performance decreased completely in a different narrow task. And this is not intelligence. This is exactly because they are not intelligent by nature. Because intelligence is its capacity of transferring knowledge of one setting to another. So I'm not so worried about the future of superintelligence, because I think it will be very hard to be achieved. I think we will need to have a very good theory of intelligence in humans in the first place. I don't think we have that. It's not agreeable what intelligence is for everyone. We now like even the TY IQ, right? The measurement, it's been contested for many years now. So it's very hard to say that we know exactly what is intelligence in humans. So I don't even want to speculate what would be super intelligence in AI machines. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for your question. And Stephen, it was great. Now it's past midnight over there. So now, well, if you want to stay, of course, you're welcome. We have a 30-minute breaks, and then we have the first mesa. Así que muchas gracias a todos los participantes, muchas gracias Stevens de nuevo para participar. Nos vamos a enviar la grabación una vez que está disponible. Te agradecemos por tu charla súper interesante, agradecemos también las preguntas de Joan Robertos. Y ahora nosotros vamos a tener un pequeño break de 20 minutos, entiendo. Y luego vamos a empezar con la primera mesa de epistemología y conocimiento y la va a moderar David Muñoz, un académico del Departamento de Formación Integral de la Universidad San Sebastián. Él también es un integrante de nuestro grupo de estudios. Así que, Steven, thank you very much. And
Gracias.
see you soon, I guess.
Yeah, gracias,
Ciao.
Joaquim. Gracias, Ever. Gracias,
Thank you,
everyone.
Steven.
Thank you. Good work for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.